Welcome to Ministry Hacks, Crew's ongoing series of webinars aimed at helping people learn how to minister in the digital world. My name is Ross McCall, and I'm part of the content team for Crew.org. Today we're going to be talking about writing on and for small screens. So what's the big deal about small screens? Well, a stat that I've become very fond of telling people is that more people in the world currently own a smartphone than own a toothbrush. So that tells you that something is going on. Closer to home here at Crew.org, we've discovered that over 50% of the people who are consuming our content aren't doing it through a laptop. They're doing it on a device this size. And that means that we have to think about, are we packaging our content in the right way? Are we telling our stories in the right way so that we can help people connect with God and move forward in their spiritual journey? Today we've got a guest speaker. I'm very excited to introduce my friend, Professor Rick Brunson. Rick and I met through church. Somebody told me that there was a journalist going to my church, so I tracked him down and we got talking, and Rick allowed me to sneak into one or two of his lectures. And Rick currently teaches mobile media journalism at the University of Central Florida. But as well as teaching, he's practicing what he preaches as a journalist for our local newspaper, the Orlando Sentinel, and for Channel 9, the TV station, and for our local NPR radio station. He also works with media outlets throughout the country. As a teacher, I couldn't think of anybody better than Rick to help us get our head around this topic of writing for small screens. Rick is teaching this topic all over the place at the moment. Here's some of the places he's been teaching recently: the Associated Press Sports Editors, the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, the board of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, one of my favorites, the Poynter Institute, where journalists love to go to be trained, and the Journalism Education Association. And his work in mobile journalism was also recognized with a National Teaching News Terrifically in the 21st Century Award from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Rick, welcome to Crew. Thanks for being here to guide us through this material today. And thank you for being part of what God's calling our movement to in the digital realm.
I'm delighted to be here with you, Ross. Thanks for the invitation.
Fantastic. Okay, over to you, Rick.
Well, welcome everyone. Glad you're with us. I wanted to start with a quick little story, if I can, about how I got involved with mobile journalism, because if you look at this face, this is not the face of a digital native. It was someone who said that necessity is the mother of invention, and I would add that necessity is the mother of reinvention. And that's what I've had to do with my own career as a journalist, as journalism has changed rapidly, dynamically in the last 10 years. And so I'll just tell a little story how I got involved with mobile journalism. Back in 2010, in the fall, I got a phone call from my niece here in Orlando, who was 19 at the time, and she called to say, "Uncle Rick, I'm getting baptized tomorrow at my church. Would you and Aunt Ruth come? I would love for you to witness this and be part of this." And she said, "And Four Rivers Barbecue is catering it." And I said, "I'm in." So, the next day, Sunday afternoon, we got in the car and we traveled over to Bethune Beach, which is about an hour north of Orlando. And there were about 400 or so people on the beach, kind of milling around, as the pastors would baptize, one by one, people who had come to be baptized in the ocean. And my wife and I were sitting up above all of this, standing at the seawall, just kind of taking it in and waiting for our niece to be baptized. And when toward the end of the service, there was this buzz, this hum that began to arise from the crowd below. And literally, it was like right out of a Cecil B. DeMille 10 Commandments film. The crowd began to part, and this gigantic, tall man with an entourage began to walk through the crowd. And as he got closer to us, I immediately recognized him as Dwight Howard, who at that time played center for the Orlando Magic, which is our NBA team here in Orlando. And my wife remembers saying that she began to talk to me and I was no longer there because I had shot off the seawall, got down on the beach because in my mind as a journalist, this had gone from being a religious event to a news story because here was Dwight Howard, who had come with his family and friends and was about to be baptized in the Atlantic Ocean, and this was a story. So I shot down on the beach just out of instinct, but then I didn't have any of the usual tools of a journalist with me. I didn't have a laptop. I didn't have a reporter's notebook. I didn't have a DSLR camera. I had none of the tools that I would normally use to report a story. What I did have in my board shorts, jangling around, was an iPhone 4, which up to that point, I had pretty much been using to text message, make phone calls, and play games on. I mean, I did not use it much as a content creating tool at all because that wasn't my mindset. But that's what I had to tell this story that was unfolding in front of me. And so I fumbled around awkwardly, found the Notepad app, opened it up clumsily with my fingers and thumbs, began to take notes about the scene that I was seeing. When Mr. Howard came out of the water, I went up to him and got a quote about what his experience was like being baptized. It started taking pictures with the camera on the phone and collecting content to tell the story. And then, once it was all over, got back on the seawall, called the Orlando Sentinel Sports web desk. I continue to work there part-time, even as a professor. And I got a hold of one of my colleagues there and said, hey, I'm over here in New Smyrna Beach, and Dwight Howard just got baptized in the ocean. You want that? And they said, absolutely, send it. Well, then the next problem is, how do I send it? So as we drove back to Orlando, I sat in the passenger seat, crafting and hobbling out this story on my phone and writing about 200 or 250 words and with the picture. And then once we hit Wi-Fi, a patch of Wi-Fi, I was able to send it to the Orlando Sentinel newsroom, and they had it up within minutes. By the time we got home, back to our house in Orlando, we were putting all of our stuff away, and my phone began to buzz on the kitchen table. And I looked at the screen, and it was a number from Bristol, Connecticut. And I'm like, who do I know in Bristol, Connecticut? And I answered it, and it was the executive producer of ESPN SportsCenter. And by the time I had gotten home and the Sentinel had put up the story, they had already seen it. The executive producer was asking if they could link to it, if they could use the photo for their Sports Center broadcast, and I'm like, absolutely. And from there, the story took off. It was the top trending story on the Sentinel's website that night. It was the number one basketball story on ESPN.com. It was shared almost 5,000 times on Facebook. And, Dwight Howard had an epiphany that day about his spiritual journey. I had an epiphany about the power of mobile journalism and what these devices can do as a tool of storytelling that up to that point I had not seen or experienced. And in that moment, saw how a story could have a huge and immediate impact just by telling the story and using this device to tell it. And so I began to see that we have what I call a newsroom in your hand, and you can see the screen of my phone, and through all of these apps that are parked there, we literally have every device we need to tell a multimedia story that we usually tell in a newsroom. I mean, you have a method to write it, you have a method to capture still photography, videography, you have means of distributing it through Twitter or Facebook. You have everything that you need to tell a story right there. You don't need a live truck anymore. You don't need to go back to the newsroom anymore. You can tell the story wherever you are in a highly effective way. And to me, that's the power of mobile journalism and mobile storytelling and what these devices can do for us. So I immediately set to going back in my role as a teacher and an educator and trying to figure out how I incorporate this device into my reporting classes. And so over the course of the next year, we developed at UCF a mobile journalism course, a standalone course, where our students now report a story strictly with their phone or with their iPhone or their iPad or an Android, whatever it is that they're carrying and toting. They tell the story on the spot from the scene immediately using just that device. So whether it's the scene of a crime or a police incident, whether it's covering a sporting event, they tell the story on the spot just with their mobile device. And it's one of the most popular courses that I teach. It fills up immediately whenever it's offered, and the students find that it greatly empowers them to use as a content creating tool, a device that they literally sleep with every night. So that's how we started the course.
Fantastic. And I can see how in the context of people who are working with crew, it's almost like that idea of citizen journalism where everybody who's got a phone now can be a journalist or can be reporting a story, whether or not they're professionally called a journalist or not. In the case of crew, everybody who's there, whether they're in the field or they're at events around the country that we're connected with, or it's something to do with their local church, they're seeing things happen all of the time, and what we're talking about is them being alert to the potential of using their phone to capture moments, whether it's a short piece of video, whether it's interviewing somebody on the spot using one of the apps that we use for recording interviews, or just taking good photos, or just capturing notes quickly when they don't actually have a notebook, so that they can tell better stories and tell those stories better later on.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think today we're going to get into the writing piece of it, because a mobile story is a multi-layered story, but it always begins with the words, right? In the beginning was the word. And so we start with the text and the words first, and then build upon that with photos and video. So in the course that I teach, we start with the words, and then there's a way that you write with and for a small screen that you do differently than when you're telling other kinds of stories. So you ready to get into that?
Let's go for
Let's
it.
get into that. So 5 things you want to think about and know about when you're writing for a small screen and with a small screen. The first thing is that you have to think always, all writing is about audience and purpose, right? We know our purpose and the message we're trying to get across. Who's the audience that we're trying to reach? So the first thing you have to consider is your mobile user and how they use this device. Is they are using it to scan, to skim, they graze. They're not reading for a depth of story. They're reading for the message that you're trying to convey. They want that information quickly. If you think of how we use this device, we're standing in a line, to get our sandwich at Subway, or we're sitting in a drive-through to get our coffee at Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks or what have you. And you're on your device and you're scrolling and you're scanning. So you have to think, how am I going to deliver the story I'm trying to tell for that purpose? When I got involved with this, one of the first places I skedaddled to was over at the Poynter Institute in St. Pete, and I met Regina McCombs, who at that point was Poynter's instructor for mobile news. And she says, you're writing for a small screen that's probably moving. You have to be super focused and help people find the information they want quickly. So the text that you're writing has to be super, super focused in terms of its themes, in terms of the message you're trying to get across. You don't take 5 paragraphs to get to the point. You have to think in terms of message, 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 message delivered in a short form. So you want to give the people who are on the other end of your story, on their mobile device, a message that they want, and you want to deliver it to them in a way that they're likely to hit that share button and distribute it to friends within their network. So thinking with the user in mind first and writing in a format that they find most useful is where we start.
So it's fair to say then, I would guess, that classically, I used to write for a magazine, and a lot of people who are writing, the majority of their experience might have been writing for a newsletter or some sort of print publication, where when people think of writing, they often think of descriptive passages, and they think of, trying to set a scene fairly substantially before you get into action. I've heard someone say that really, particularly with this kind of writing, we need to drop people in at a moment of action, that we don't have the time to do the setup and the stuff that many of us think of as writing.
That's excellent. That's excellent advice, and there's real wisdom in that. You have to get right to the point with mobile. That's not denying the power of narrative storytelling for other types of formats and modes of publication. But in a mobile device, you do want to drop people in right away, give them the information that they're wanting, that they're seeking, or that you want them to have right away, right at the top, and help move them through that story that you're telling quickly. So that's point one. The next important thing to remember is to keep your writing and your prose simple. You want to use simple words, simple sentence structure, paragraphs of 2 to 3 sentences long at the most. You want to be clear and concise and conversational in the tone that you're using in the writing. You want to journalistically think of those 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why. And typically your mobile story, you're keeping to about 250 to 300 words. It's not a super long narrative. So it's a small, compact mini story. And that's where the discipline comes in, is keeping that focus and keeping all of the information you're trying to convey, narrowing it down into a scrollable, scannable, easily and quickly digestible format. And keeping your prose simple helps do that.
So in terms of readability, I've heard various things, but probably the thing I remember hearing someone say is that good readability for this kind of writing is, can it be read and understood by a 12-year-old?
Yeah.
Now, as I know, as an editor, I've worked with writers who found that difficult when I told them that they needed to be writing for a 12-year-old. But it's really that if the 12-year-old can understand it, all of their audience can understand it, and the older people can understand it more quickly. Is that true?
Absolutely. Brevity and simplicity are the two amigos of really good mobile writing. The example that we have here on the screen, and it's kind of funny and whimsical, bovine flatulence isn't hard news necessarily, but when you look at this story as it appeared on the AP News mobile app, it was the most shared story on this particular day. And, part of it is the weirdness of the story, but I think another key part of it is how the story is written. The sentences are short, the paragraphs are short, they get right to the point. It's subject, verb, direct, object, and it packs a lot of information that into 3 short little blocks and chunks of type, and was well received by, obviously, thousands, if not millions, of readers for the AP, which is the largest news organization in the world. So they've got a good handle on this. So keeping it simple is really important. The next thing to consider is to do what I call keeping it chunky. You want to present the information that you have in chunks, so that as the person is scrolling through, it's presented in a way that's easy to consume. Mm-hmm. So what do we mean by that? So if you have information in your story that can be broken into a bulleted list, bullet, statement, point that you're trying to make, that's very helpful. If you have if you're going to have information in paragraphs, if you can break those paragraphs out with subheads, that makes it easy to consume. You want to include a line of space between the paragraphs just in terms of formatting, because that makes it easier to read and consume and more quick of a read for the mobile user. So keeping it chunky is really helpful, because again, that screen is small. You're only doing 250, 300 words. Presenting it that way is going to make it much more highly likely that the story is read and consumed.
So I can imagine with something like that, for example, within Crew, classically the kinds of writing that I see us doing are telling stories about people coming to know Jesus or moving forward spiritually, often connected to our ministry in some way. Thematic or topical pieces about an issue that we see going on, like depression is something that people have read a lot about on our website. And resource pieces where Crew has a huge bank of spiritual development resources that we continue to refresh and repackage and try and deliver to people the best way we can. I can see with the topical pieces and the resource pieces how bulleted lists and so forth, that will make perfect sense. When we're just telling a story about somebody overcame this obstacle in moving forward spiritually, and they did so by meeting this person connected to Crew, for example. When it's a simple narrative, I could imagine many of our writers finding it difficult to think about how do they use bulleted lists and so forth in those examples. Would you say that they shouldn't use bulleted lists in those examples, or is there still a way to do what you're saying and keeping it chunky, even when you're simply telling a narrative?
Yeah, so if you're focusing on a person, it's a people story. One of those chunks can be maybe a compelling quote that the person says that you can pull out and break out as one of those chunks that is going to. The more compelling the quote, obviously, the better, because it will keep the person, the reader, engaged and moving through the story. So quote helps. Maybe bio information like age, background, things like that you can break out and chunk into the story when it's more of a profile kind of a piece.
So actually you can use lists sometimes to do in less words what would maybe suck time in the story itself.
Exactly.
You can do it in a little list to the side.
Exactly. An example of this from the Washington Post here is and this of course is a breaking news story, a hard news story. So when there was a shooting at a local mall, they begin with a headline, an intro graph of here's what we know so far, and then they break out the facts that have been confirmed in the case. And look how quickly they got this up. I mean, so the 911 call came in at 11:15 that morning, and this was posted at 12:51 in terms of the information they had gathered to that point. They didn't wait until 3 or 4 or 5 o'clock or to file and post a complete narrative of the story. That they did do that later for their desktop website and for their print newspaper, but in the meantime, they're sharing what they know with their readers as they have confirmed it and know it, and they present it in a way that the reader wants to know. What do I want to know about this story? What are the facts? What are the details that are most relevant and interesting? They're presented in a bulleted format, so you go bang, 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 and you know what you need, and then you move on with your day. So, Good example. Yeah. The next point is that think of how you can move this story forward. What is new? What is the latest? If you can build a sense of urgency into the story that you're trying to tell. What is new? What is the most up-to-date about this person you're writing about, this topic you're writing about? Think urgency, think new, think now. Because mobile consumers, mobile users, that's why they have this device, is they can know what they need to know right now. It's not so much of a lean back experience where you're sitting at the end of the day necessarily and have more time to deep dive into a story or into an article. They want to know what's going on now with whatever topic it is that you're trying to engage them with. And then it's also important to point them to what's next. So this is where a call to action can come into. It's great in a mobile story. At the end of the story, having a good call to action, or what's next in this person's life that you're writing about, or where next do you want to go with this topic. That's an important piece and facet to have in your story. This is a good example from, again, the Associated Press. They do every day on their mobile app 10 things you need to know for the next day. So I read this on a Sunday night. So they're already looking ahead. What do I need to know for tomorrow? They're looking forward, and they're presenting it in a very chunky way. Intro paragraph, a headline, and a short list of brief summaries of potent information that's helpful. So new, now, next. And then the final point is, none of this works without a good headline, which gives me great comfort because I've spent most of my career as an editor writing headlines. And so in a mobile setting and in a digital setting, headlines have never been more important in how we craft them, because without a good headline, no one ever reads the story below it. So we need to use and pack that headline with good SEO, which by now everybody knows stands for search engine optimization. So searchable keywords, things like names, formal names, and whole names, first and last names of prominent people, locations. This is a ministry that's all over the world. So what country are you writing from? Are you writing from Zimbabwe, or are you writing from Romania? Put the location that's the focus of the story in the headline. Category: are we talking about depression? Are you talking about evangelism? Try to think of what the category of this story, this basket that it falls into, and put that in your headline. You want to keep it clear, concise, and keep it tight. A 6 to 7 word headline. Google indexes much better than a longer headline. The longer your headline gets, and we get kind of deceived and seduced by the wonderful thing at the internet is that we're not confined by space and like we are in print, right? But we can still drone on and get too long in our headlines, and Google will stop indexing them. So the Google algorithms still prize and value brevity, and so we want to keep our headlines. We can go a little longer than print, but you still want to keep it tight so that your headline is picked up and read. So do you want to talk about the BBC? I mean, you're
that would be the British
the British.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, Rick.
When I got into this and began immersing myself into this subject area, what I quickly discovered was that the journalists and the news organizations that really were at the tip of the spear on this topic were all in the UK, and especially the BBC. They miles ahead of American news organizations at that time, and they continue to lead the way. So the BBC and their news app that is free and can be downloaded by anyone. If you look at the stories that they present, and we'll look at this one. This is one that they published about Saudi Arabia lifting the ban on women driving in that country. So when you click on it and take a look at it, they have a nice SEO headline. Saudi Arabia is in the headline. Women, the topic, the category is in the headline, and it's concise. It doesn't run all day long. It's a nice, tight headline. And then it begins with a video at the top, and then look at the way the information is presented. There's a lead. The topics of the story are broken out into bullets. There are subheads. There's what happens now. There's that new, now, next aspect. How did we get here? Where is it going? The information is very much layered and presented in a chunky fashion so that it's quickly consumed and and tells you everything you need to know and leads you to other information that's related that you may want to know if you want to go even deeper and farther into this story. So they do it very well. They do mobile very well at the BBC. And if there's a style that you would like to learn from as someone getting into this, I can think of no better place to look and a template to model than what the BBC is doing with mobile storytelling.
So for writers within Crew and also for editors, I presume, if I asked you, how do they go about becoming acclimated to writing for mobile, you would say, read this,
take a look
study
at
what they're doing.
Study what they're doing
Okay.
and emulate what they're doing because it's working for them. And just purely as a user, as someone who picks up my phone every day to consume content and to follow the news, the way they do it is a wonderful user experience. And so I keep returning to them, and that's what you want folks to do with your content as well. And let's see. So let's talk about how do you do this, the technical aspect of this. It's really simple. There's what now, over 300, 400,000 apps out there for mobile devices. To do this, the writing part of this, you really only need two. There's the native notepad that's on your app if you have an iPhone, or you can download the Word document app from Microsoft. And the Word app actually gives you a few more technical tools such as bullets and subheads and things like that to make writing in this format on the spot and on the scene a lot easier. So just with those two tools, you can get started doing this.
Do you find that, so I've discovered recently obviously the dictation button that's there for using on text messages and so forth, and it tends to be on a lot of apps now. Do you ever find yourself in a reporting type situation where you think actually stopping to do this would be more complicated and you'd actually record something, like you would actually dictate a story?
I did that in the first year or so, and I got away from it because what I found happening is I would dictate, and it wasn't a clean, seamless transfer from the dictation to the actual words that would show up on the screen.
Right.
And I would get a lot of garbled words that I would have to go back and clean up, and that would take time. So I use the device to interview other people. So a voice messaging app or a digital voice recorder app, it works really well on the phone if I'm interviewing someone and I'm trying to record what they say, and then can go back and listen to the interview and capture content from that. But I haven't had much success with using dictation apps because of the time on the back end to clean up the garbage from the words that get translated into something else. Utah becomes uterus or something like
That's
that.
unfortunate.
Yeah, that I have to go back and change and clean up. So
Yeah. I'm curious, what are the most common mistakes you see writers making in adapting to mobile?
I think it all comes down to focusing on what is really important and being your own good first self-editor, right? The discipline of thinking and teasing out what are the most important elements of this story that I need to tell for the end user of my story on a mobile device. And then just leave everything else on, as we say, the cutting room floor, figuring out what is most compelling, what is most informative, what is most important, and sticking to that. And leaving out other extraneous details that for a longer version of the story, which you still can tell in a different format, in a different place, but leave it for that longer narrative story. For mobile, keep it concise, keep it brief, keep it moving.
Okay. So as someone who's worked as an editor here at Crew, I can hear the gnashing of teeth of writers all through the ministry who have struggled with turning in a draft to me that was 1,000 words, and I said we need to get that down to 500, and that has felt like a brutal process for them. You said earlier that really your ideal mobile story is somewhere between 250 and 300 words.
If you want somebody to read it.
If you want someone
And
to
isn't
read
that
it.
the point?
It is the point.
That's the point. I mean, 3,000 words of beautiful prose is a beautiful thing, but it's not
No one's
beautiful
gonna
if
read
no
it.
one's going to read it on this device.
And in our situation especially, I think one of the things that we're realizing is that traditionally, if you're a writer, the thing that you most want is that your article is read. That is the ultimate metric. Was it read? So we would measure the number of people who came to a page and the amount of time they spent on that page. Because if 1,000 people came to the page I wrote and they only stayed for 10 seconds, 1,000 people didn't read my story. However, what I think we're realizing is that, and this maybe is bad news for writers in one sense, is that the metric isn't did people read the whole thing? It's did they connect with it enough to act upon it? As a ministry, the content that we're producing, we're not really a publishing house as such, although we have a publishing arm. The point is that people come to the content and do something as a result of it. And so if it happens that they get halfway through and they see something that pushes them to that call, they take that action without necessarily finishing the story. From the ministry perspective, that's okay. From the writer's perspective, obviously we still have to hand them a box of tissues at that point that they didn't finish the story. Is that just the reality with writing for mobile? That you have to know what your goal is and put that before necessarily someone finishing your article?
You started our conversation with a very important stat for your ministry, in that more than 50% of the people coming to you are coming to your content on a mobile device. And that's true across the whole entire world that we live in now in terms of media. People are consuming most of the information that they're getting on a mobile device. The other thing we have to remember that attention spans are ever more shrinking.
Yeah.
We're fighting for attention for our message and for the reader's time. And so less really is more. If you think about it, if they're more likely to read your message and get your message and consume your message when it's presented in a format that's friendlier to them, it's a win. If we don't present people information in a way that they're likely to read it, and we have the best, most compelling message in the world, but we don't put it in a way that they're going to read it and engage with it and interact with it, what's the point? Yeah. So this is where people are living now, and we have to reach people where they live to reach them with the message that we want to reach them with.
I think that's been the big sort of evolution for me as a writer, as an editor. I began working for Cruise magazine, and the way I understood it is, classically someone is going to take that magazine, it's going to come in the mail, they're going to take it, they're going to put it aside until they've got a time to actually sit down and engage with it. They're probably going to pour themselves a cup of coffee and sit down and go through that magazine, probably from start to finish. What you're saying is that really with this kind of content, someone is on public transport on their way somewhere, or they're in line waiting for something, or they're in the drive-through and waiting to collect their coffee or whatever it might be. And we just have to play by different rules if we want to get the same people to take a step of faith.
Yeah. Henry Luce, who was the great founder of Time magazine and that whole, family of magazines, used to say that the power of journalism is that we seep into people's consciousness. And I think that's true even more in the mobile digital age in which we live. You have the opportunity with a mobile story presented in a mobile format to seep into someone's consciousness with your idea, with your message, with the information that you're trying to get across to them. And it's something that seeps is very tiny, right? Mm-hmm. Is very small. And the more you can make that small story compelling in a big way, I think is you still have a chance to have an impact with what you do and what you're communicating.
Great. Rick, thank you so much for being with us
Always
today.
a
We've
pleasure,
enjoyed
Ross.
it.
Thank you.
So you're watching this ministry hack, and maybe at the end of this, you're thinking, where do you go from here? Perhaps you're a writer or an editor within the ministry, or someone in another role who just finds themselves increasingly drawn into communications and marketing type activity. If that's you, we're here to help. If you have a question for us about today's topic or something related, or if you're involved in a project that you would like to consult with the marketing team of Crew about, or perhaps you're a writer or an editor with a passion for helping people grow closer to God. We're looking for people like you, and we want to help people like you. Crew.org is a place that you could be contributing your writing and your editing skills to. You could send a brief writing sample to us, or just a description of how you see yourself contributing to Crew.org, or how we can help you. Just email us at content@crew.org. Rick, thanks again for being with us today, and thanks to everyone for watching. We'll see you again soon.